3 legions had vanished in a single morning, swallowed by forest and ambush, their standards lost, their names erased from the parade ground. That wound, the memory of Varus and the Teutoburg disaster, shaped Rome's shame as surely as any scar shapes a face. It was into that wound that Arminius walked, first as Rome's auxiliary, then as the organizer of a resistance that would force the empire to answer. This is the story of a battle for freedom that was never a single pitched fight, and of Rome's reckoning that stretched over years of marshes, raids, and monuments. Arminius stands at the center of this conflict, not merely as the man who betrayed Rome in the minds of Roman writers, but as the focal point of Germanic resistance, a leader who could turn local knowledge and tribal networks into a military threat. Rome, for its part, could not abide the memory of humiliation. The empire sought restoration, to recover lost symbols, to punish those who had dared, and to show its citizens and allies that the legions still commanded the field. Between these forces moved Germanicus Julius Caesar, son of Drusus and heir in prestige if not in power, charged by public expectation and imperial calculation to deliver retribution. Tiberius, standing at the summit of Roman power, watched with a mixture of approval and anxiety. He would permit strikes across the Rhine, but never the kind of open, sustained conquest that might eclipse his own authority. The political shock of 14 CE, soldiers restless, a mutiny that needed channeling, offered Germanicus both motive and manpower. The princeps was cautious. Germanicus was not merely a commander, but an instrument of politics. The campaigns that followed between 14 and 16 CE were a coalition of motives: vengeance, honor, propaganda, and a pragmatic desire to prevent future disasters on that frontier. Tacitus and other sources record the campaigns with a tone that mixes admiration for Roman discipline and unease at the brutality such discipline could unleash. The years that followed would test Roman logistics against Germanic terrain, cavalry against ambush, pride against patience. If Rome's aim was reckoning, Germanicus would try to deliver it with the methods Rome knew best: disciplined marching columns, scouting detachments, reserves held ready to seal breaches, and a readiness to adopt hard, punitive measures. But the theater was not the plains of Italy. It was river and forest, bog and coastal inlet. The Germans had an advantage in terrain and in the fluid loyalties of the tribes. The alliance that Arminius shaped was never monolithic. Segestes, for example, remained a Roman ally and a political counterpoint to Arminius. In this complex weave of loyalties and hatreds, the first punitive strikes set the tone. The winter that followed Varus's memory saw the Marsi deceived. Sources report that Roman forces struck during a feast, an act that is recorded as both ruthless and calculated. The massacre at the Marsi shows the blunt instrument Rome could wield, a sudden strike designed to terrorize and to break the will of whole communities. Germanicus's forces burned villages, razed sanctuaries, and drove a scorched earth policy intended as punishment and deterrent. The moral weight of such actions cannot be denied. Scholars and ancient authors register them with a mixture of awe and horror. The Marsi attack produced immediate tactical success in the narrow sense: dead enemies, destroyed supplies, and a message sent across the Rhine. But it also cemented resistance in other quarters, helping Arminius knit together a broader coalition. Brutality, Rome learned, can cow a people, and can also harden them into a more determined opponent.
The campaigns that followed demonstrate the Roman insistence on combined arms and logistics, and they show the Germanic skill in using landscape as a weapon. When Germanicus pushed in force during the spring of 15 CE, he brought one of the largest operations against the tribes since Varus, 8 legions and numerous auxiliaries, organized to strike along multiple axes, to divide and to neutralize the scattered tribal forces. The strategy was clear: do not allow the Germans to mass, force them into defensive reactions, recover what was lost in 9 CE. Logistics mattered as much as sword strokes. Ships moved along rivers, bridges and causeways were repaired or constructed, supply trains marched day after day. The campaign emphasized occupation of symbolic sites as much as military victories. One target was Mattium, a settlement associated with the Bructeri, which Roman forces captured and razed. The reoccupation and refortification of a Drusus-era post signaled an attempt to recreate Roman presence on the frontier, to use the memory of Rome's earlier expansion as both anchor and provocation. In these movements, the recovery of standards, the lost eagles of the legions, carried larger meaning. The return of an eagle was not simply the retrieval of metal and fabric, it was the restoration of honor, public reassurance that Rome's gods and military fortunes were being appeased. Tacitus reports the recovery of the 19th Legion, and these recoveries were staged as proof that Rome's humiliation could be erased. The spectacle mattered: captive leaders presented, trophies raised, news sent back to Rome for the triumphal narrative. Politics and propaganda intertwined most clearly in the case of Thusnelda and Segestus. Thusnelda, held in Roman custody and presented later in triumphal display, became a symbol both of Rome's power and of Germanic tragedy. Segestus, a noble Roman ally among the Carusi, had long opposed Arminius's designs, a reminder that the Germanic coalition was neither inevitable nor unanimous. The Romans used these divisions.
Bringing Segestald and Thusnelda into Rome's orbit was both military and political theater, a proof of victory, a ready visual for the public who demanded proof that Rome could still command dominion. Yet Rome's machinery was not infallible. The land itself proved to be a third adversary. Rivers and bogs undermined roads. Causeways that seemed firm would suddenly collapse into mire. Wagons would sink, horses become trapped, and the rhythm of a legion's march would be broken. The Pontes Longi, the long wooden causeways that crossed marshes and quick ground, were the scene of particular peril. Sources report that in one operation, a Roman column found its line of march cut by water and destroyed timber, a tactic likely orchestrated by locals familiar with the ground and with the timing of tides and spring floods. Panic could spread swiftly. Soldiers who had been schooled to stand firm could be unmoored by the sensation of sinking, by the creak of timbers giving way under the weight of men and machinery. It was in moments like these that Roman discipline was tested and Roman formation adapted. The hollow square, the holding reserve, the tight defensive perimeter around wagons and wounded, these measures did not eliminate danger, but they created a chance for recovery. Aulus Caecina Severus, one of the commanders active during these operations, had to rally troops in dark and confused nights when fear threatened to become rout. Night alarms, false reports, the rumor of enemy approach, such psychological strains could be as dangerous as a spear. Yet Roman order often found purchase. Thrown reserves steadied lines. Cavalry scouts, when deployed effectively, reopened eyes to the surrounding reality. Alongside inland fighting, Rome experimented with seaborne movement. Building temporary canals and using ships along the Ems and Flavo lakes, Roman units attempted to turn the coasts into highways to flank tribes that might otherwise avoid engagement. But the North Sea is not easily tamed. Storms wrecked transport, waves overturned supply vessels, and troops meant to land in force found themselves scattered along an indifferent shore. The logistic gamble sometimes paid. Landings that reached a target could deliver a pound of iron where diplomacy could not. Other times the sea reclaimed what Rome attempted to take, a reminder that the empire's reach had limits. All the while, Arminius observed and reacted. He was not a monarch of a unified nation, but a leader among tribal elites, a commander who could coordinate raids, ambushes, and defensive flooding, and who still had to manage rivalries among the Cherusi, Marsi, Bructeri, and others. At Arbelo, Roman scouts and cavalry tested Germanic resistance. In some encounters, the Romans would find themselves stalled by terrain or surprised by hidden reserves. At other times, the Germanic lines would break under disciplined Roman shock tactics.
The campaigns were a study in ebb and flow, Roman columns advancing with engineers and veterans, Germanic horsemen and footmen striking at weak points and then dissolving back into forest. Each side learned. Intelligence became decisive. Where Varus had failed to scout, Germanicus tried to ensure thorough reconnaissance. Where Arminius had exploited local knowledge at Teutoburg, Roman commanders now sought countermeasures, scouts ahead, flanking detachments, and the use of cavalry to screen columns. The year 16 CE brought the decisive engagement that would stand as the climax of this multi-year contest. Sources recount Germanicus pushing toward the Weser, aiming to force a general action and to settle accounts. A naval build-up was made to support movement, and Roman legions advanced under the attention of their commanders. It was at a place called Idis de Viso that the broad clash occurred. There the legions and their auxiliaries met Germanic forces arrayed in strength. Scouts marked lines, cavalry prepared for maneuver. The fighting was brutal and close, infantry locked in, auxiliae testing the flanks, cavalry riding wide to press the enemy's edges. The Roman advantage on that day lay in its cavalry. Once employed to outflank, the mounted troops struck into the reserves and rear of the Germanic line, a blow that Tacitus portrays as breaking the cohesion of the Germanic formations. Without a secure reserve, flexible tribes found themselves trapped between disciplined infantry and the hammer of cavalry. Losses were heavy on both sides. The ground was soon strewn with the dead. Yet amid that carnage, Arminius survives in the reports, wounded perhaps, and certainly driven from the field, but not captured. Sources describe him slipping through the chaos, his fate that day obscured by the fog of war. The Romans marked their success by erecting tropaea, wooden trophies inscribed with victory and set upon fields of encounter. The tropium was a statement, an answer in wood and ritual to the years of insult, a reckoning visible for all to see. Even with this battlefield success, the day's victory did not translate into permanent empire. The Romans had won in the field, and they had the trophies to prove it, including further recoveries of standards that had haunted Rome's imagination since Varus. Yet geography, logistics, the political horizon in Rome, and the persistence of Germanic resistance meant no decisive annexation. The cost of stationing legions through the region would be enormous. The interior remained hostile to permanent garrison. Moreover, political calculation in Rome complicated what a commander in the field might wish to accomplish. Germanicus's popularity after these campaigns was immense. Crowds welcomed the recovered eagles, and the captives paraded in triumph. The Emperor Tiberius, however, grew uneasy.
History records an exchange between public approval and senatorial calculation.
The spectacle of reconquest risked inflating Germanicus's prestige in a way that might unsettle the Principate. The recall of Germanicus to Rome, therefore, was less a military necessity than a political choice. Scholars have long debated motive and meaning. Tacitus reports the tensions and admires Germanicus while hinting at imperial jealousy. What is clear is that the recall undermined the possibility of sustained occupation. Rome's reckoning had been performed in the short term, a brutal series of punitive expeditions, recovery of symbols, and temporary reassertions, but it stopped short of transforming Germania into a permanent province. There were other outcomes that complicated the tale. Coastal losses of ships and men, the failure to secure roads and towns permanently, and the continuing skill of Germanic leaders to retreat when needed and rise again later, meant that both sides paid. For Rome, the spectacle mattered almost as much as the strategic result. The triumphs back in the capital, the erection of Tropea, and the ceremonial repatriation of the standards provided closure to a public that needed it. The legions, too, required visible vindication for past failings. But the very theatricality of the return, the captives, the trophies, the gifts offered by provinces, also masked the unfinished business on the Rhine and beyond it. Arminius, for his part, remained a living problem for Rome. He continued to command loyalty among many tribes, yet he was neither uncontested nor invincible. Internal disputes, rivalries, and the shifting loyalties of subject peoples meant that his coalition could be fragile. The dynamic between the leader who sought local autonomy and the empire that sought to enforce order turned the conflict into a recurring contest rather than a single conclusive moment. Arminius's escape from decisively being struck down at Idistavaso ensured that his legend for Romans remained a specter, the man who had caused the empire to pause and to pay attention. It is important to note how the narratives we rely upon shape our memory of these events. Roman historians such as Tacitus wrote with a particular lens: admiration for Roman discipline, disgust at Roman excess, and a moralizing undertow that colors descriptions of both barbarian ferocity and Roman vengeance. Where sources diverge or remain quiet, modern readers must be cautious. We can say with fair confidence that Germanicus led punitive campaigns in 14 to 16 CE, that the Romans recovered some standards and erected Tropea, that battles like Idistavaso were bloody engagements where cavalry proved decisive, and that political recall curtailed further campaigns. But finer details, the exact numbers killed, the personal motives of figures beyond what is recorded, or the private conversations that swayed decisions, remain beyond full capture. The historians then, like us now, piece together fragments and report what seems most plausible. When the dust settled, the costs were both human and political. Villages had been razed, captives taken, families torn apart. Scenes recorded in classical sources convey both Roman pride and a sense of moral unease. The spectacle of recovery, the standards, the captives, the trophies, served Rome's need for closure, but it also exposed the limits of imperial power in a landscape that refused easy domination. The emperor's decision to recall a popular general signaled the primacy of political stability over military conquest. In the end, Rome's reckoning with Arminius was partial. It answered the question of honor in the short run, but it did not erase the Germanic will to resist or fully secure the empire's frontier. That partiality is the core paradox of this battle for freedom. Arminius forced Rome to respond, to commit force and ceremony, to stage an answer to humiliation. Rome, for a time, reclaimed its symbols and inflicted suffering on communities it deemed rebellious. Yet the imperial project ran against geography and against the nature of the Germanic polities themselves.
Freedom in this context is not a modern ideological category, but a refusal by Arminius and those who followed him to accept Roman domination without cost. Reckoning for Rome was both a military campaign and a political theatre intended to reassure the metropolis and to caution would-be imitators. The campaigns of Germanicus are therefore both exemplary and ambiguous. They exemplify Roman military capacities, engineering works to bridge marshes, tactical formations that could withstand panic, the coordination between legions, auxiliaries, and cavalry. They show the empire's ability to project force. They also reveal vulnerability, supply lines fraying under weather and terrain, seaborne expeditions subject to storms, and politics superseding military aims when the emperor feared a rival in the making. For the Germanic peoples, Arminius's leadership is a study in uses of local advantage. He exploited knowledge of riverine floods, of forests where columns could be isolated, and of night and seasonal conditions that could surprise a disciplined but territorially unaware foe. He built a coalition that, while fragile, could operate in a way the Romans had not fully anticipated after Varus. He transformed localized resistance into a systemic problem for the empire, forcing several years of costly military response. And yet, the story does not end with Edistoviso. The campaign's political fallout rippled through Rome. Germanicus's return, the public rejoicing, and the subsequent shadow of his early death and the trial of Piso would become the next chapters in this saga. Tiberius's recall was not merely an administrative move, it set in motion intrigues and suspicions that would shape imperial politics in ways that bled back into military decisions. The uneasy balance between praising a victorious general and avoiding the emergence of a popular rival is one of the darker realities of Rome's principates. When we step back from the smoke of battle and the ceremonial wood of Tropea, we see that this clash was never reducible to winners and losers in simple terms. Rome's reckoning punished and ostentatiously repaired honor, but it did not deliver a permanent pacification. Arminius remained alive in memory and in threat, even if temporarily driven from the field. The campaigns of 14 to 16 CE are therefore a lesson in the limits of imperial reach, the perils of underestimating terrain and local networks, and the complex interplay between military action and political calculation. If the question is whether Arminius won freedom and whether Rome's reckoning was complete, the sober answer is both and neither. Arminius did not build a nation-state in the modern sense. He did, however, compel the greatest power of his day to act, at great cost and with mixed results. Rome did achieve symbolic justice and temporary military victories. It did not secure a decisive, lasting conquest of the Germanic interior. The Tropea remained to tell the story of victory. The rivers and forests continued to provide refuge for resistance. This clash, then, reveals something essential about empire and resistance. Empires can strike and can triumph in the theater of battle. They can recover what was lost and stage their justice for public consumption. Yet geography, coalition dynamics, and the limits of logistics persist as restraints. Leaders like Arminius demonstrate how local knowledge and leadership can transform a regional insurgency into a matter of imperial concern. In the end, both sides carved their claims into memory, Rome in wood and public ceremony, Arminius in the stubborn refusal of the tribes he rallied. If you want the full arc of Rome versus Arminius, the campaigns, the politics, and the personal costs that followed, subscribe and follow the series. The aftermath left unresolved tensions. Ships still lay broken on distant shores. Survivors of villages long burned remained in exile, and back in Rome, political intrigue gathered like a storm cloud. Germanicus's recall presaged a tragic turn. He would die young, his end surrounded by controversy, and the trial of Piso would expose the corrosive intersection of power, jealousy, and grief.
Those episodes are the natural continuation of a story that began in the shadow of Varus and in the rise of a man who turned Roman failure into Roman obsession. Battle for freedom. Arminius had forced Rome to face its limits and to stage its retribution. Rome's reckoning had been fierce and memorable, but it was in many ways incomplete. The wood of the Tropea would rot, the memory would be kept and retold, the Rhine would remain a frontier, not simply of territory, but of wills.
History records the clash with both admiration and lament, and it leaves us with a lesson about power. It can be asserted, it can be displayed, but it cannot always be secured by spectacle alone. If this chapter of Rome's frontier has gripped you, like and share this episode, and watch the next installment where we examine the mysterious death of Germanicus and the storm of accusations in the trial of Piso, the political aftermath to a war that never quite reached a tidy conclusion.